Good evening, all, and welcome back to Untold Fears. Tonight, we venture into one of Canada's most terrifying wilderness areas, where gold prospectors have vanished without a trace, and bodies are discovered in the most disturbing condition imaginable. Deep within the remote Nahanni Valley, something stalks those who dare to seek their fortunes, leaving behind only headless corpses as a warning to others. For over a century, this cursed landscape has claimed victim after victim, each meeting the same grisly fate in what locals whisper about as the Valley of Headless Men. From the early 1900s to the present day, 10 souls have encountered unspeakable horror in this forsaken place, their final moments lost to the wilderness forever. These are not legends or folklore, but documented cases that have baffled investigators and left families searching for answers that may never come. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now, let us step into the shadows of the Nahanni Valley, where civilization ends and terror begins. The autumn of 1904 brought whispers of fortune to the remote trading posts of Canada's Northwest Territories. McKenna MacLeod sat by the crackling fireplace in her modest cabin near Fort Liard, watching her three brothers, Frank and Willie, argue over the newspaper clippings that had arrived with the last mail delivery. The headlines spoke of gold strikes in the Yukon, of men becoming millionaires overnight, of opportunities that would not wait for the cautious or the hesitant. McKenna was the eldest of the MacLeod siblings, a woman whose Scottish heritage showed in her piercing blue eyes and determined jaw. At 32, she had already buried one husband to the unforgiving northern wilderness and had sworn she would never again watch someone she loved disappear into the vast expanse of untamed territory that stretched beyond their doorstep. But Frank and Willie were not men to be swayed by a sister's concerns, no matter how rational. The brothers had heard tales from the Dog Rib Indians who occasionally passed through their settlement. These indigenous traders spoke of a mysterious valley to the north, where coarse gold nuggets could be found along creek beds, some as large as a quarter ounce. The Indians called it a place where spirits dwelled, where the earth itself was angry and protective of its treasures. But Frank and Willie heard only the word gold, and their eyes gleamed with the fever that had consumed so many men before them. In the spring of 1905, after months of preparation and planning, the brothers announced their intention to venture into the Nahanni Valley. McKenna pleaded with them to reconsider, to content themselves with their modest but steady income from trapping and trading. She had seen what gold fever did to men, how it transformed rational individuals into reckless seekers willing to risk everything for the promise of easy wealth. Frank, the older of the two at 28, possessed the quiet confidence of a man who had spent his entire life surviving in the wilderness. He could read weather patterns in the shape of clouds, find direction by the moss on trees, and live off the land for months at a time. Willie, 2 years younger, was more impetuous but equally skilled in the ways of the frontier. Together they made a formidable team, and McKenna knew that if anyone could succeed in the treacherous Nahanni country, it would be her brothers. The brothers had already made one preliminary expedition in 1904, traveling through British Columbia and parts of southeast Alaska to scout potential prospecting areas. Upon reaching the Nahanni region, they encountered a group of Dog Rib Indians carrying gold nuggets on the upper Flat River. The natives were reluctant to reveal the exact location of their find, but Frank and Willie were observant men. They noted that the meeting occurred near the Flat River, and they reasoned that the gold source must be somewhere in the general vicinity. Their initial prospecting efforts yielded modest results. They discovered some small sluice boxes constructed by the natives and managed to extract enough gold to fill a small glass bottle, along with about 10 ounces stored in a moosehide bag. It was not a fortune, but it was proof that gold existed in the region, and for men possessed by gold fever, proof was all they needed to justify a more extensive expedition. McKenna spent the winter of 1904 trying to dissuade her brothers from their planned return to the Nahanni Valley. She reminded them of the harsh realities of wilderness prospecting, of the countless men who had ventured into remote regions never to be seen again. She spoke of the practical difficulties of extracting gold from such a distant location, of the challenges of transporting equipment and supplies, of the hostile environment that claimed lives with casual indifference. But Frank and Willie had already committed themselves to the venture. They spent the cold months acquiring equipment, studying maps, and making contact with potential investors who might fund their expedition. They corresponded with traders and trappers who had knowledge of the northern territories, gathering intelligence about routes, weather patterns, and local conditions. By the spring of 1905, the brothers had finalized their plans. Unlike their previous expedition, this would not be a brief scouting mission. They intended to establish a semi-permanent camp in the Nahanni Valley and to spend the entire summer season extracting whatever gold they could find. They planned to winter in the valley if necessary, returning home only when they had accumulated enough wealth to justify their efforts. McKenna made one final attempt to convince them to abandon their plans. She offered to help them establish a more traditional business, perhaps expanding their trapping operations or investing in trading ventures that, while less lucrative, were considerably safer. She reminded them that they already had enough gold from their first expedition to prove the existence of deposits in the region, and that they could sell this information to larger mining companies rather than risking their lives in personal extraction efforts. Frank and Willie listened respectfully to their sister's concerns, but their minds were made up. They assured her that they would take every precaution, that they would return by autumn at the latest, and that the wealth they would bring back would secure the future of the entire family. They promised to send word whenever possible, to mark their route clearly so that others could follow if necessary, and to abandon the venture if conditions proved too dangerous. In May of 1905, Frank and Willie McLeod departed Fort Liard for what they believed would be their final prospecting expedition. They traveled with a third companion, a Scottish engineer whose identity would later become a matter of considerable speculation and controversy. The three men carried enough supplies to last through the summer, along with the tools and equipment necessary for serious gold extraction efforts. McKenna watched her brothers disappear into the wilderness with a heavy heart and a growing sense of foreboding. Something about this expedition felt different from their previous ventures, more final somehow, as if she were watching them walk not just into the forest, but into the pages of history itself. The summer of 1905 passed without word from Frank and Willie. McKenna told herself that this was not unusual, that communication from such remote regions was difficult and unreliable. The brothers had warned her that they might not be able to send messages regularly, and she tried to content herself with the knowledge that no news was not necessarily bad news. Autumn arrived, then winter, then spring again, and still there was no sign of the McLeod brothers. McKenna's concern deepened into genuine alarm as the season cycled without bringing her brothers home. She made inquiries among the traders and trappers who traveled the northern routes, but no one had seen or heard from Frank and Willie since their departure. By the spring of 1907, McKenna knew that something terrible had happened. Her brothers were experienced woodsmen who would not simply vanish without explanation. Even if their prospecting efforts had failed, even if they had encountered difficulties, they would have found a way to send word or to return home. Their continued absence could only mean that they had met with some form of disaster. The discovery of an abandoned canoe in a driftwood pile on the South Nahanni River in 1907 confirmed McKenna's worst fears. The canoe matched the description of the type that Frank and Willie had brought into Nahanni country, and its presence suggested that something had prevented the brothers from completing their planned return journey. McKenna immediately began organizing a search expedition. She contacted the Royal Northwest Mounted Police, gathered volunteers from among the local trappers and traders, and began making preparations for a comprehensive search of the Nahanni Valley. She was determined to learn the fate of her brothers, to bring them home if they were still alive, or to recover their remains if they were not. The search party that McKenna assembled included some of the most experienced wilderness travelers in the territory. Among them was Sergeant Joy of the Royal Northwest Mounted Police, 2 members of the Lafferty family who knew the northern rivers intimately, and her younger brother Charlie, who insisted on participating despite McKenna's concerns about risking another family member. In the summer of 1908, McKenna led her search party into the Nahanni Valley, following the route that Frank and Willie had planned to take 3 years earlier. The expedition was methodical and thorough, covering vast areas of wilderness while looking for any sign of the missing brothers or their Scottish companion. It was Charlie who made the discovery that would haunt the McLeod family forever. In a remote section of the valley that would later be named Dead Man's Valley, he found 2 human skeletons lying near the remains of what had once been a campsite. The bones were scattered and bleached by years of exposure to the elements, but enough remained to suggest that these were the remains of Frank and Willie McLeod. The scene that confronted McKenna and her search party was one of unspeakable horror. Both skeletons were headless, their skulls nowhere to be found, despite an extensive search of the surrounding area. The camp showed signs of having been destroyed by fire, and the positioning of the bones suggested that the brothers had died suddenly and violently. One skeleton lay with an arm stretched toward where a rifle would have been, suggesting that at least one of the brothers had attempted to defend himself. The other was positioned as if he had leaped suddenly from his bedroll, perhaps awakened by whatever threat had descended upon their camp. Blankets and personal effects were scattered around the site, but anything of obvious value, including the gold that the brothers had presumably extracted, was missing. McKenna stood over the remains of her brothers, overwhelmed by grief and a rage that burned deeper than any gold fever. Frank and Willie had not simply died in the wilderness. They had been murdered, their lives taken by someone or something that had left their headless corpses as a gruesome calling card in the remote valley. The mystery of what had happened to Frank and Willie McLeod would never be fully solved. The Scottish engineer who had accompanied them was never found, leading to speculation that he might have been responsible for their deaths, or that he too had fallen victim to whatever force had claimed the brothers. The gold that they had worked so hard to extract was gone, suggesting that robbery might have been a motive, but the decapitation of the victims seemed excessive for a simple theft. McKenna returned to Fort Leard with the remains of her brothers, carrying with her not just their bones, but the burden of unanswered questions that would torment her for the rest of her life. The Nahanni Valley had claimed Frank and Willie McLeod, adding their names to a growing list of victims who had ventured into that cursed region in search of fortune and found only death. The site where the McLeod brothers died became known as Dead Man's Valley, and the creek that ran nearby was christened Headless Creek, names that would serve as permanent reminders of the horror that had unfolded in that remote wilderness. But for McKenna McLeod, these geographical markers were small comfort compared to the devastating loss of the 2 men she had tried so desperately to protect from the lure of fool's gold and the Valley of the Headless Men. Olivia Chen had always been drawn to places where tragedy left an indelible mark on the landscape. As a paranormal investigator, specializing in electromagnetic phenomena and residual hauntings, she had spent the better part of 5 years documenting unexplained occurrences across Canada's most remote wilderness areas. But nothing had prepared her for the overwhelming sense of malevolence that permeated the air the moment she set foot in Dead Man's Valley. The October air was crisp with the promise of winter when Olivia arrived at the coordinates where the McLeod brothers had been discovered over a century earlier. She had spent months preparing for this expedition, studying historical accounts, interviewing indigenous elders, and gathering the most advanced paranormal detection equipment available. Her goal was simple in theory, but complex in execution: to document and analyze any residual energy signatures that might remain from the violent deaths that had occurred in this cursed valley. Olivia's scientific background in atmospheric physics gave her a unique perspective on paranormal phenomena. Unlike amateur ghost hunters who relied on folklore and emotional responses, she approached each investigation with rigorous methodology and state-of-the-art instruments designed to detect electromagnetic field fluctuations, temperature variations, and infrasound frequencies that might indicate supernatural activity. Her work had been published in several peer-reviewed journals, lending credibility to a field often dismissed by mainstream academia. The hike into Deadman's Valley took 3 days, following ancient game trails that wound through dense stands of spruce and pine. Olivia traveled alone, as she had learned that the presence of multiple people often contaminated readings and created false positives in her equipment. She carried everything she needed in a specially designed backpack that protected her sensitive instruments from moisture and impact damage. As she established her base camp near the site where the McLeod brothers' remains had been discovered, Olivia felt an immediate change in the atmosphere around her. The forest, which had been alive with the sounds of birds and small animals throughout her journey, fell into an unnatural silence. Even the wind seemed to die away, leaving the valley wrapped in a stillness that felt more like a held breath than peaceful quiet. Her electromagnetic field detector began registering unusual readings almost immediately. The device, which measured fluctuations in the Earth's magnetic field that often preceded paranormal manifestations, showed patterns unlike anything Olivia had encountered in her previous investigations. Instead of the random spikes typical of equipment malfunction or atmospheric interference, the readings displayed a rhythmic quality that suggested intelligent manipulation of the electromagnetic spectrum. As darkness fell on her first night in the valley, Olivia positioned her cameras at strategic points around the campsite, each equipped with full-spectrum sensors capable of detecting light across the entire electromagnetic spectrum, including infrared and ultraviolet wavelengths invisible to the human eye. She arranged motion detectors in a perimeter around her tent and activated audio recording equipment sensitive enough to pick up sounds below the threshold of human hearing. The first manifestation occurred at exactly 11:37 p.m. Olivia was reviewing data from her earlier equipment test when her motion detectors began registering movement along the eastern edge of her campsite. The readings showed something approximately human-sized moving through the forest, but when she directed her infrared spotlight toward the location, nothing was visible to the naked eye. Her cameras, however, told a different story. The full-spectrum sensors detected what appeared to be columns of light moving between the trees, pulsing with a bluish-white radiance that seemed to emanate from no identifiable source. The lights moved with purpose and intelligence, pausing at certain locations as if examining the area before continuing their ghostly procession through the darkness. Olivia watched in fascination as her equipment tracked the phantom lights across the valley floor. The electromagnetic readings spiked dramatically whenever the lights appeared, suggesting that whatever was generating these manifestations was drawing enormous amounts of energy from the surrounding environment. Temperature sensors detected localized cold spots that moved in perfect synchronization with the lights, creating zones of frigid air that dropped 15 degrees below the ambient temperature. The most unsettling aspect of the phenomena was the accompanying audio signatures. Her sensitive microphones picked up what sounded like whispered conversations in a language Olivia could not identify. The voices seemed to emanate from the same locations as the lights, creating an eerie stereo effect as the spectral procession moved through the forest. When she ran the audio through spectral analysis software, the results showed frequency patterns consistent with human speech, but filtered through some medium that rendered the words unintelligible. On her second night in the valley, the manifestations intensified dramatically. The phantom lights appeared earlier in the evening and remained active for longer periods. Olivia documented over 40 separate light phenomena, ranging from small orbs that danced among the treetops to massive columns of luminescence that extended from the ground to a height of 30 feet or more. The most extraordinary event occurred at 2 a.m. when her cameras captured what appeared to be human figures composed entirely of light moving through the campsite. The beings were translucent and flickered like flames, but maintained recognizable human proportions and movement patterns. Through her infrared sensors, Olivia could see that the figures generated no heat signature, suggesting that they were not composed of conventional matter. As she watched through her night vision scope, one of the spectral figures approached her tent and seemed to peer directly at her through the fabric walls. The electromagnetic readings at that moment peaked at levels that should have been impossible, given the remote location's distance from any power sources. The figure remained motionless for several minutes, as if studying her presence in the valley before dissolving into wisps of light that scattered among the trees. The experience left Olivia shaken but determined to gather more evidence. She had dedicated her career to finding scientific explanations for paranormal phenomena, and the events in Dead Man's Valley represented the most significant supernatural activity she had ever encountered. The consistency and complexity of the manifestations suggested that something was actively attempting to communicate, though the purpose remained unclear. On her third night, Olivia made a breakthrough in her attempts to establish communication with the entities. Using a modified electromagnetic pulse generator, she began transmitting simple patterns of electromagnetic radiation into the environment. To her amazement, the phantom lights responded with similar patterns, creating what appeared to be a primitive form of two-way communication. The exchange continued for over an hour, with Olivia transmitting increasingly complex sequences and receiving corresponding responses from the entities. The interaction suggested a level of intelligence and awareness that challenged conventional understanding of paranormal phenomena. These were not simple residual hauntings playing out traumatic memories, but conscious entities capable of learning and adaptation. The most chilling moment came when Olivia transmitted a sequence representing her own name in binary code. The response was immediate and unmistakable. The lights formed patterns that spelled out danger in clearly recognizable letters of luminescence that hung in the air for several seconds before fading away. As if responding to some unheard signal, the forest around Olivia's campsite began to come alive with movement. Her motion detectors registered activity from every direction as dozens of phantom lights emerged from the surrounding wilderness. The electromagnetic readings climbed to levels that threatened to overload her equipment, and the temperature dropped so rapidly that frost began forming on her tent, despite the relatively mild October weather. The spectral figures that had appeared individually on previous nights now manifested as a complete gathering, forming a circle around Olivia's campsite. Through her camera, she could see that many of the figures appeared to be missing their heads, their necks ending in wisps of light that flickered like candle flames in a breeze. The image was a horrifying confirmation of the valley's bloody history, suggesting that the victims of past violence had somehow become trapped in this location. The entities seemed to be trying to communicate something urgent to Olivia, but the electromagnetic interference generated by their presence was overwhelming her recording equipment. Static filled her audio channels, and her video feeds began displaying strange artifacts and distortions that made clear observation impossible. The only message that came through clearly was the repeated warning, "Leave now." Understanding that she was witnessing something beyond her ability to fully comprehend or safely document, Olivia began the difficult process of packing her equipment while surrounded by the supernatural manifestation. The phantom lights watched her every movement, maintaining their protective circle as she dismantled her cameras and sensors. Some of the spectral figures moved closer, as if trying to offer assistance or guidance, but their electromagnetic presence interfered with her electronic devices to such a degree that several pieces of equipment suffered permanent damage. As Olivia prepared to leave the valley, the intensity of the paranormal activity began to subside. The phantom lights gradually faded, and the electromagnetic readings returned to normal levels. The oppressive silence that had characterized the valley gave way to the natural sounds of a forest at night, as if the supernatural entities had released their hold on the environment. But just as Olivia shouldered her pack and prepared to begin her journey back to civilization, she witnessed one final manifestation that would haunt her for the rest of her life. A massive column of light erupted from the exact spot where the McLeod brothers had been discovered, rising high above the tree line before exploding into thousands of smaller lights that scattered across the valley like luminous snow. In that moment of supernatural pyrotechnics, Olivia heard a sound that made her blood freeze in her veins. The unmistakable sound of human screaming, filled with terror and agony, echoing across the valley as if the brothers' final moments were being replayed for her benefit. The screams continued for nearly a minute before fading into silence, leaving Olivia alone in the darkness with the certain knowledge that she had witnessed the residual energy of a violent and traumatic death. The hike out of Deadman's Valley took 4 days instead of the planned 3, as Olivia found herself constantly looking over her shoulder and taking detours to avoid areas where her equipment registered unusual electromagnetic activity. She had entered the valley as a skeptical scientist seeking empirical evidence of paranormal phenomena. She left as a believer who understood that some mysteries were better left undisturbed. The data she collected during her 3 nights in the valley would form the basis for groundbreaking research into residual hauntings and electromagnetic manifestations of traumatic events. Her documentation of intelligent communication with paranormal entities opened new avenues of investigation that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness and the persistence of human awareness after death. But for Olivia personally, the experience in Deadman's Valley represented a turning point that forced her to confront the possibility that scientific methodology had its limitations when dealing with forces that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional physics. The phantom lights of the Valley of the Headless Men had shown her that some truths could only be experienced, never fully explained or understood through empirical observation alone. Kaylin Reeves had always been fascinated by the discrepancies between official records and witness testimonies, a skill that served her well as a forensic historian specializing in cold cases from Canada's frontier period. When she first encountered the file on Martin Jorgensen, the Swiss prospector whose death in 1917 had been hastily classified as a robbery gone wrong, she immediately recognized the hallmarks of an investigation that had been concluded too quickly and with too little evidence. The case had haunted Kaylin for 3 years before she finally secured funding for a comprehensive reinvestigation. Unlike the amateur treasure hunters who occasionally ventured into the Nahanni Valley seeking lost gold, Kaylin approached the mystery with the methodical precision of an academic researcher. She had spent months poring over archival documents, interviewing descendants of original witnesses, and correlating weather records, river levels, and wildlife migration patterns from the period in question. What she discovered challenged every aspect of the official narrative surrounding Martin Jorgensen's death. The Swiss prospector had not been a naive newcomer to the northern wilderness, as portrayed in most historical accounts. Born in the alpine regions of Switzerland, Jorgensen had spent his childhood learning to survive in harsh mountain environments that were arguably more challenging than anything the Canadian North could present. He was an experienced mountaineer, a skilled hunter, and according to letters he had sent to relatives in Zurich, a cautious man who understood the dangers of prospecting alone in remote locations. Jorgensen had arrived in the Nahanni Valley in early 1916, following rumors of rich gold deposits along the Flat River. Unlike the McLeod brothers, who had approached their prospecting efforts with optimistic enthusiasm, Jorgensen displayed a systematic approach that suggested military or engineering training. He had carefully scouted multiple locations before selecting a site for his cabin, choosing a position that provided clear sight lines in all directions while remaining concealed from casual observation. The cabin itself, based on descriptions from the men who discovered the remains, had been a substantial structure built to withstand harsh winter conditions. Jorgensen had invested significant time and effort in creating a defensible position, complete with rifle ports cut into the walls and multiple escape routes leading into the surrounding forest. This was not the home of a man who felt safe in his chosen location. Kalin's investigation revealed that Jorgensen had been corresponding regularly with a cousin in Switzerland throughout 1916 and early 1917. The letters, which she located in the Swiss National Archives, painted a picture of a man who had indeed discovered gold in commercially viable quantities, but who was increasingly paranoid about being watched and followed. In his final letter, dated March 15, 1917, Jorgensen wrote that he had observed strangers in the area on multiple occasions and was considering relocating his operation to a more remote location. The official report of Jorgensen's death, filed by Raymond Patterson of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, stated that the prospector had been killed during a robbery attempt by unknown assailants who had then burned his cabin to destroy evidence. The report was based on observations made during a brief visit to the site in late summer of 1917, months after the actual death had occurred. Patterson had concluded that Jorgensen was shot from ambush, robbed of his gold, and decapitated either as a warning to other prospectors or to prevent identification of the remains. However, Kalin's analysis of the physical evidence descriptions revealed significant inconsistencies with the robbery theory. Jorgensen's rifle had been found cocked and loaded near his remains, suggesting that he had been prepared for trouble, but had not had the opportunity to fire a shot. His personal effects, including a gold watch and jewelry that would have been valuable to robbers, had been left behind in the burned cabin ruins. Most significantly, the positioning of the body suggested that Jorgensen had been outside his cabin when he was killed, contradicting Patterson's theory that he had been ambushed while returning from work. The more Kalin studied the case, the more convinced she became that Martin Jorgensen's death had been far more complex than a simple robbery. The systematic destruction of his cabin, the careful removal of his head while leaving other valuables behind, and the timing of the murder all suggested something beyond common criminal activity. She began to suspect that Jorgensen had discovered something in the Nahanni Valley that someone was desperate to keep secret. Her breakthrough came when she discovered a series of land registry documents that had been overlooked by previous investigators. The records showed that Jorgensen had formally staked multiple claims along the Flat River, following proper legal procedures and filing the appropriate paperwork with territorial authorities. More importantly, he had sent detailed geological surveys and ore samples to assay offices in Vancouver and Montreal, proving that his gold discoveries were substantial and scientifically documented. The assay reports revealed that Jorgensen had found not just placer gold in stream beds, but actual lode deposits in solid rock formations. This type of find was exponentially more valuable than simple panning operations, representing the potential for industrial-scale mining that could generate enormous profits for decades. Jorgensen's claims, if validated, would have made him one of the wealthiest men in Canada, but the claims had never been validated because Jorgensen had died before, completing the legal process of proving his discoveries. Under territorial law, his death had invalidated the claims, returning the land to the public domain where it could be restaked by anyone with knowledge of the original finds. Kalin realized that someone with access to Jorgensen's private records would have known exactly where to look for the richest deposits. Her investigation took a darker turn when she discovered that Raymond Patterson had resigned from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police within 6 months of investigating Jorgensen's death, citing personal reasons. Patterson had subsequently moved to Vancouver, where he had invested in several mining ventures that had made him wealthy enough to retire comfortably by age 45. The timing and circumstances of Patterson's career change raised questions about possible corruption or conflict of interest. Kalin traveled to Vancouver to examine Patterson's business records, discovering that he had indeed acquired mining claims in the Nahanni Valley area shortly after leaving the police force. Working through shell companies and intermediaries, Patterson had systematically bought up land rights throughout the region, where Jorgensen had been prospecting. The claims had been developed quietly over several years, generating substantial profits that Patterson had carefully concealed from tax authorities and former colleagues. The evidence suggested that Patterson had not simply investigated Jorgensen's murder, but had likely been involved in planning and executing it. As the investigating officer, Patterson had complete access to Jorgensen's private papers, including detailed maps showing the locations of his most promising finds. He would have known exactly how much gold Jorgensen had extracted and where additional deposits could be found. But Patterson had not acted alone. The systematic nature of the murder, the professional manner in which the scene had been cleared, and the sophisticated financial arrangements used to exploit Jorgensen's discoveries all pointed to a larger conspiracy. Kalin suspected that Patterson had been working with a network of corrupt officials and criminal associates who specialized in claim jumping and murder for hire. Her suspicions were confirmed when she discovered records showing that several other prospectors in the region had died under suspicious circumstances during the same time period. In each case, Patterson had been involved in the investigation, and in each case, the victims' claims had subsequently been acquired by associates of Patterson's business partners. The Nahanni Valley murders were not random acts of violence, but part of a systematic campaign to eliminate competition for the richest gold deposits in the territory. The most disturbing aspect of Kalin's investigation was her discovery that the conspiracy had continued long after Jorgensen's death. Her research revealed that Patterson's mining syndicate had been actively discouraging prospecting in the Nahanni Valley for decades, using a combination of intimidation, sabotage, and selective murder to maintain control of the most valuable claims. The legend of the Valley of the Headless Men had been deliberately cultivated to frighten away potential competitors. Jorgensen's death had been particularly brutal because he had posed the greatest threat to the conspiracy's operations. His detailed geological surveys and professional mining background had given him the expertise to identify the true extent of the gold deposits in the region. If he had lived to develop his claims properly, he would have attracted the attention of major mining companies that would have flooded the valley with legitimate prospectors and security personnel. By murdering Jorgensen and destroying his cabin, Patterson and his associates had not only eliminated a dangerous rival, but it also created the perfect cover story for their ongoing criminal activities. Every subsequent death in the valley could be attributed to the mysterious curse that had supposedly claimed the Swiss prospector, deflecting attention from the organized crime syndicate that was systematically looting the region's mineral wealth. Kalin's investigation revealed that Martin Jorgensen had been far more than just another victim of frontier violence. He had been a skilled professional whose death had been orchestrated by corrupt officials who had then spent decades profiting from his discoveries while maintaining the fiction that the Nahanni Valley was cursed by supernatural forces. The truth about Jorgensen's murder had been buried under layers of official incompetence and deliberate misdirection, but the evidence was still there for anyone with the patience and skill to uncover it. The Swiss prospector had died not because he was unlucky or unprepared, but because he had discovered something that powerful men were willing to kill to possess. As Kaylin compiled her findings into a comprehensive report, she realized that she had uncovered more than just the solution to a century-old murder case. She had exposed a criminal conspiracy that had operated with impunity for decades, protected by carefully cultivated legends and the isolation of the northern wilderness. The mystery of Martin Jorgensen's death was solved, but the implications of her discoveries raised disturbing questions about how many other deaths in the Nahanni Valley had been the result not of supernatural curses or random violence, but of calculated murder committed by men who understood that the remoteness of the location made it the perfect place to eliminate inconvenient witnesses to their crimes. Martin Jorgensen had been a man who knew too much in a place where knowledge was more dangerous than the harsh wilderness itself. His headless corpse had become part of the legend of the Valley of the Headless Men, but the real horror lay not in supernatural forces, but in the calculated brutality of human greed and the lengths that men would go to protect their ill-gotten gains from the consequences of discovery and justice. Davian Mackenzie had always prided himself on his ability to read the wilderness like an open book. As a Royal Canadian Mounted Police officer with 12 years of experience patrolling the remote territories of northern Canada, he understood the language of broken twigs, disturbed earth, and scattered bones that told the stories of survival and death in the unforgiving frontier. But nothing in his extensive training had prepared him for the methodical brutality he encountered when he arrived at Bennett Creek in the summer of 1927 to investigate the death of a man known only as Yukon Fisher. The request for investigation had come through official channels, but with an urgency that suggested something more than routine police work. Fisher had been a person of interest to the RCMP for several years, wanted for questioning in connection with a series of gold thefts that had plagued trading posts throughout the Yukon Territory. He was described as a cunning individual who had managed to evade capture by constantly moving through the most remote and dangerous regions of the North, places where even experienced law enforcement officers feared to venture alone. When Davian first laid eyes on the remains at Bennett Creek, he immediately recognized the hallmarks of the mysterious deaths that had been plaguing the Nahanni Valley for over 2 decades. Fisher's skeleton lay sprawled near the water's edge, bones bleached white by 2 years of exposure to the harsh northern elements. Like the McLeod brothers before him, Fisher had been decapitated with surgical precision, his skull removed so cleanly that no damage was visible to the remaining cervical vertebrae. The location of Fisher's death was particularly significant to Davian's investigation. Bennett Creek flowed directly into the South Nahanni River, less than 3 miles from the site where the McLeod brothers' headless remains had been discovered in 1908. The proximity suggested that whatever force was responsible for these gruesome murders had claimed a specific territory and was defending it against all intruders with lethal efficiency. Davian spent 3 days methodically examining the scene, documenting every detail that might provide clues to Fisher's final moments. The positioning of the bones suggested that Fisher had been killed while making camp for the night, his bedroll still visible as fragments of rotted fabric caught among the riverside stones. A rusted rifle lay partially buried in silt near the remains, its chamber empty and firing pin jammed, suggesting that Fisher had attempted to defend himself but had been overwhelmed before he could effectively use his weapon. The most disturbing discovery was the evidence of systematic surveillance that Davian uncovered throughout the surrounding forest. Hidden observation points had been constructed among the trees, offering commanding views of the creek and any travelers who might approach the area. These positions were not the crude blinds that hunters might build for stalking game, but sophisticated installations that showed evidence of regular maintenance and long-term occupation. Whoever had been watching Bennett Creek had done so with military precision and patience that spoke of professional training or extensive experience in wilderness warfare. The observation posts were positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire, ensuring that no one could approach the creek undetected. Stone-lined pits contained the charred remains of countless small fires, suggesting that the watcher had maintained his vigil for months or even years before Fisher's arrival. Davian's investigation revealed that Fisher had not been a random victim, but a carefully selected target who had been tracked and studied before his murder. Scratched into the bark of several trees near the observation posts were detailed notations recording Fisher's movements, his camping habits, and his daily routines. The killer had been documenting his prey's behavior with the methodical thoroughness of a natural scientist studying animal specimens. The notations were written in a code that initially baffled Davian, but careful analysis revealed it to be a modified version of military field notation used by scouts and reconnaissance specialists. The killer was not a simple criminal or deranged prospector, but someone with advanced training in surveillance and assassination techniques. The systematic nature of the observations suggested that Fisher had been under surveillance for weeks before his death. More troubling still was Davian's discovery that the surveillance network extended far beyond Bennett Creek. Following animal trails and hidden paths through the forest, he located additional observation posts scattered throughout the valley, each positioned to monitor key river crossings and camping areas used by travelers through the region. The scope and sophistication of the operation suggested that multiple victims had been tracked and killed over the years. The evidence pointed to the existence of what Davian could only describe as a professional killer who had claimed the Nahanni Valley as his personal hunting ground. This individual was not driven by gold fever or territorial disputes, but by something far more sinister: the systematic elimination of anyone who ventured too deeply into the region's mysteries. The decapitation of victims was not a cultural ritual or symbolic warning, but a practical measure designed to prevent identification and complicate police investigations. Davian's most chilling discovery came when he found Fisher's personal effects cached in a hollow tree near one of the observation posts. Among the items was a leather pouch containing over 30 ounces of gold nuggets, proving that Fisher had indeed struck it rich somewhere in the valley. But rather than stealing the gold, Fisher's killer had carefully preserved it as if creating a trophy collection from his victims. The gold itself told a disturbing story. Chemical analysis of the nuggets revealed that they had been extracted from at least 4 different locations throughout the Nahanni Valley, suggesting that Fisher had been an exceptionally successful prospector who had discovered multiple rich deposits. His knowledge of the valley's mineral wealth would have made him invaluable to mining interests or territorial authorities seeking to develop the region's resources. The killer's decision to leave such valuable evidence behind suggested that his motives were not financial, but personal. Someone was actively working to prevent the development of the Nahanni Valley's gold resources, eliminating anyone who got too close to discovering the true extent of the mineral wealth hidden in the region. The systematic nature of the murders pointed to a long-term campaign designed to maintain the valley's reputation as a cursed and dangerous place. Davian's investigation took a darker turn when he discovered evidence that the killer was still active in the area. Fresh notations had been carved into trees near his own campsite, documenting his arrival and movements with the same methodical precision that had been applied to Fisher's surveillance. The killer was watching him, studying his patterns, and preparing for another murder. The realization that he had become the hunter's next target forced Davian to radically alter his investigative approach. Instead of conducting a systematic search of the area, he began moving erratically through the forest, changing his route and camping locations without warning, trying to disrupt any surveillance that might be targeting him. He slept in hidden positions away from obvious camping spots and maintained constant vigilance for signs of observation or pursuit. Despite his precautions, Davian could not shake the feeling that he was being constantly watched by unseen eyes that tracked his every movement through the valley. Twice he found evidence that someone had approached his campsite during the night, leaving no footprints, but disturbing vegetation in ways that suggested careful observation from close range. The killer was demonstrating his ability to approach undetected, a psychological intimidation tactic designed to unnerve his intended victim. On his 7th night in the valley, Davian finally encountered the Nahanni stalker face to face. Awakened by the sound of movement near his carefully concealed camp, he discovered a figure standing motionless among the trees, watching him with the patient stillness of a predator evaluating its prey. The man was tall and lean, dressed in clothes that had been deliberately darkened to blend with the forest shadows. His face was obscured by darkness, but his eyes reflected the faint starlight with an intensity that spoke of madness or fanatical dedication. The confrontation lasted only seconds before the figure melted back into the forest with fluid grace that spoke of years spent moving through the wilderness like a ghost. Davian pursued, but found only disturbed undergrowth and the lingering scent of wood smoke that seemed to follow the killer like a supernatural signature. The encounter had been deliberately brief, a message rather than an attack, demonstrating the killer's ability to approach undetected whenever he chose to do so. The psychological impact of the encounter forced Davian to acknowledge that he was outmatched by an adversary who knew the valley intimately and possessed skills that exceeded his own considerable wilderness expertise. Continuing his investigation would almost certainly result in his own death, adding another headless corpse to the growing list of victims claimed by the Nahanni Valley. Davian made the difficult decision to withdraw from the valley and report his findings to superior officers who might be able to organize a larger expedition with sufficient manpower to capture or eliminate the killer. But his official report was met with skepticism and bureaucratic indifference that reflected the territorial government's reluctance to acknowledge the existence of a serial killer operating in remote regions that generated little public or political interest. The case of Yukon Fisher was officially closed as death by misadventure, despite the overwhelming evidence that he had been systematically stalked and murdered by a professional killer who continued to operate in the Nahanni Valley. Davian's detailed reports of the surveillance network and evidence of ongoing criminal activity were buried in administrative files where they would remain hidden for decades. The failure of the authorities to take action against the Nahanni stalker ensured that the killer would continue his deadly work unimpeded. Davian's investigation had revealed the existence of a methodical murderer who had claimed the valley as his personal territory and would kill anyone who threatened to expose its secrets. The legend of the Valley of the Headless Men would continue to grow, fed by the calculated brutality of a killer who understood that isolation and official indifference provided perfect cover for his crimes. Fisher's death had not been the random act of wilderness violence that the official record suggested, but part of a systematic campaign of terror designed to prevent the exploitation of the valley's mineral wealth. The Nahanni stalker was not a supernatural force or mythical creature, but a human predator whose deadly efficiency had created one of the most enduring mysteries of the Canadian frontier. Davian left the Nahanni Valley with the certain knowledge that Fisher's killer was still out there, still watching, still waiting for the next prospector or investigator foolish enough to venture too deeply into the secrets of the Valley of the Headless Men. Janessa Baptiste had grown up listening to her grandmother's stories about the spirits that dwelled in the mountains beyond the Liard River. As a member of the Dene First Nation, whose family had guided travelers through the Northern Territories for generations, Janessa understood that the wilderness contained forces that existed beyond the comprehension of the white prospectors and government officials who periodically ventured into their ancestral lands. But even her grandmother's warnings had not fully prepared her for the supernatural encounters that would begin during the summer of 2019, when she accepted a contract to guide a group of environmental researchers into the heart of the Nahanni Valley. The research team consisted of 4 scientists from the University of Alberta, who were conducting a comprehensive study of climate change impacts on northern ecosystems. They required a guide with intimate knowledge of the valley's geography and weather patterns, someone who could safely navigate the complex river systems and unmarked trails that crisscrossed the region. Janessa's reputation as one of the most skilled guides in the Northwest Territories had earned her the recommendation, despite the fact that several other experienced guides had declined the contract after learning that the research would take place in the vicinity of Deadman's Valley. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the expedition's lead scientist, had been dismissive of the local legends surrounding the valley, attributing the stories of headless corpses and mysterious disappearances to frontier superstitions and the tendency of isolated communities to mythologize unexplained deaths. She insisted that the team would maintain strict scientific protocols throughout their research, using GPS navigation and satellite communication equipment to ensure their safety in the remote wilderness. Janessa had accepted the contract despite her misgivings, motivated partly by the substantial payment offered and partly by curiosity about whether the valley's supernatural reputation had any basis in reality. Her grandmother had always maintained that certain places in the mountains were spiritually active, locations where the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead became permeable under specific conditions. The expedition entered the Nahanni Valley in late June, following the South Nahanni River upstream toward their designated research sites. The journey proceeded normally for the first week, with the scientists collecting water samples, documenting wildlife populations, and measuring temperature variations in different ecological zones. Janessa found herself enjoying the work, appreciating the researchers' systematic approach to understanding the complex environmental processes that shaped the northern wilderness. The first supernatural encounter occurred on their 8th night in the valley, as the team was camped near the confluence of Headless Creek and the main river. Janessa was awakened in the early morning hours by the sound of voices speaking in a language she did not recognize, though it seemed somehow familiar, like words heard in half-remembered dreams. The voices carried clearly across the water, despite the considerable distance from which they seemed to originate, suggesting either supernatural acoustics or speakers with extraordinarily powerful lungs. Initially, Janessa assumed that another group of travelers had made camp somewhere upstream, though she was puzzled by the timing and location of their presence. Few people ventured into this particular section of the valley, and those who did typically traveled during daylight hours, rather than maintaining conversations in the pre-dawn darkness. She lay in her sleeping bag, listening to the distant voices, trying to determine their direction and distance, but the sound seemed to shift and move like something carried on an unpredictable wind. As dawn approached, the voices gradually faded, leaving behind only the normal sounds of a northern forest awakening to another day. Janessa mentioned the incident to Dr. Mitchell during breakfast, suggesting that they might encounter other people in the area and should be prepared to share camping sites or coordinate their research activities. The scientist expressed skepticism about the reported voices, pointing out that sound could travel unusual distances in mountain environments, and that Janessa might have heard wildlife vocalizations that seemed like human speech in the ambiguous state between sleep and wakefulness. The second encounter occurred 3 nights later, as the team was camped in a meadow that provided clear views in all directions. This time, Janessa was not alone in hearing the supernatural voices. Dr. Mitchell and 2 of her colleagues were awakened by what they described as a heated conversation taking place somewhere in the darkness beyond their campsite. The voices were speaking English, or something close to English, but with accents and pronunciation patterns that made individual words difficult to understand. The scientists retrieved their recording equipment and attempted to document the phenomenon, but their sensitive microphones detected only normal forest sounds despite the clearly audible conversation that all 4 expedition members could hear simultaneously. The voices seemed to exist in a frequency range that human ears could perceive, but electronic devices could not capture, suggesting either advanced acoustic manipulation or phenomena that operated outside conventional physical laws. Dr. Mitchell's scientific training made her reluctant to accept supernatural explanations for the voices, but she could not deny the evidence of her own senses. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with distinct individual speakers who seemed to be engaged in some form of argument or negotiation. Occasionally, individual words or phrases would emerge clearly enough to understand, revealing discussions about gold deposits, territorial claims, and warnings about dangerous individuals in the area. Janessa recognized some of the content as relating to historical events in the valley, including references to the McLeod brothers and Martin Jorgensen that suggested the voices belonged to people who had been present during the early 20th century murders. The speakers seemed to be discussing their own deaths, debating responsibility for the violence that had claimed their lives, and expressing concern about the safety of living people who ventured too deeply into the valley's mysteries. The most disturbing aspect of the supernatural conversations was their interactive quality. When Dr. Mitchell attempted to respond to the voices by calling out questions, the speakers would pause and seem to consider her words before resuming their discussion in tones that suggested they were aware of the living listeners. The dead were not simply replaying memories of past conversations, but engaging in real-time communication with the expedition members. On their 5th encounter with the valley's spirits, Janessa witnessed a visual manifestation that accompanied the auditory phenomena. As the familiar voices began their nightly conversation, she observed translucent human figures moving through the mist that rose from the river at dawn. The figures appeared to be engaged in the conversation she was hearing, their mouths moving in synchronization with the voices, while their ghostly forms drifted between the trees like smoke given human shape. The spectral figures were clearly recognizable as the victims of the valley's violent history. Several appeared to be missing their heads, their necks ending in wisps of ectoplasmic substance that flickered like candle flames. Others showed signs of the violence that had claimed their lives, with burn marks and wounds that glowed with supernatural light in the pre-dawn darkness. Despite their horrific appearance, the spirits seemed more concerned with communication than intimidation. Dr. Mitchell and her colleagues observed the manifestations through night vision equipment that revealed additional details invisible to the naked eye. The spirits generated electromagnetic signatures that registered on the team's scientific instruments, suggesting that the phenomena had measurable physical properties despite their supernatural nature. Temperature sensors detected localized cold spots that moved with the ghostly figures, and electromagnetic field detectors registered fluctuations that correlated with the intensity of the spiritual manifestations. The breakthrough in communication came when Janessa realized that the spirits were responding to Dean words and phrases that her grandmother had taught her for communicating with the ancestral dead. When she began speaking in her traditional language, acknowledging the spirit's presence and asking for their guidance, the conversations became more coherent and purposeful. The dead were eager to share their knowledge of the valley's dangers, but they required appropriate cultural protocols to facilitate clear communication. Through Janessa's translation, the spirits revealed that the valley's supernatural activity was not random, but followed patterns related to seasonal changes, lunar cycles, and the presence of living people with specific ancestral connections to the land. The dead were bound to the valley by the violent nature of their deaths, but they retained enough awareness to serve as guardians and guides for those who approach them, with proper respect and understanding. The most chilling revelation came when the spirits warned that the valley's historical pattern of violence was not simply a relic of the past, but an ongoing threat. They spoke of a malevolent presence that had been responsible for many of the deaths attributed to natural causes or human conflict, something ancient and territorial that viewed all human intrusion as a violation requiring deadly punishment. The headless corpses were not the result of human murderousness, but evidence of encounters with something that existed beyond conventional understanding. As the expedition prepared to leave the valley, the spirits provided Janessa with specific warnings about routes to avoid and locations where the malevolent presence was most active. They emphasized that the valley's supernatural guardians could offer some protection to those who acknowledged their presence and followed traditional protocols, but that scientific skepticism and cultural insensitivity could leave visitors vulnerable to forces that had claimed dozens of lives over the previous century. The research team's final night in the valley was marked by the most intensive spiritual activity Janessa had ever witnessed. Dozens of ghostly figures gathered around their campsite, creating a protective circle that extended into the forest in all directions. The spirits were responding to some unseen threat, marshaling their supernatural abilities to shield the living visitors from danger that only they could perceive. Throughout the night, Janessa could hear the spirits engaged in what seemed like spiritual warfare, their voices raised in chants and warnings that echoed across the valley with otherworldly intensity. The temperature dropped dramatically, and electromagnetic activity spiked to levels that overloaded the scientists' recording equipment. Something was testing the spiritual defenses that the dead had erected around the expedition, probing for weaknesses that might allow it to claim additional victims. As dawn broke on their final morning in the valley, the spiritual activity gradually subsided, leaving behind an atmosphere of exhausted victory. The protective spirits had successfully defended the expedition against whatever malevolent force had threatened them during the night, but the effort had clearly depleted their supernatural energy. Many of the ghostly figures appeared faded and translucent, as if the night's spiritual combat had weakened their ability to maintain manifestation in the physical world. Janessa led the research team out of the Nahanni Valley with a profound understanding of the supernatural forces that had shaped its violent history. The voices from the mist were not simply echoes of past trauma, but active spiritual presences that continued to influence events in the valley. The dead had become guardians, using their supernatural abilities to protect visitors who approached them with appropriate respect, while warning others about dangers that conventional science could not detect or understand. The expedition's documentation of supernatural phenomena in the valley would eventually be published in peer-reviewed journals, lending scientific credibility to indigenous knowledge systems that had recognized the spiritual dimensions of the northern wilderness for countless generations. But for Janessa personally, the experience had confirmed her grandmother's teachings about the persistence of spiritual presence in places marked by violence and trauma. The voices from the mist had spoken across the boundary between life and death, sharing their knowledge and offering their protection to those brave enough to listen and wise enough to understand that some mysteries transcended the limitations of empirical observation and scientific methodology. Kiana Rodriguez had always believed that meticulous preparation was the key to survival in Canada's most remote wilderness areas. As the lead geologist for the 1943 Ministry of Natural Resources expedition into the Nahanni Valley, she had spent 8 months planning what would become the most comprehensive mineral survey ever attempted in the region. Her team of 6 specialists represented the finest scientific talent available to the Canadian government, each selected for their expertise in fields ranging from geological mapping to wildlife biology. None of them would ever return from the valley that had already claimed so many lives. The expedition had been commissioned in response to strategic mineral shortages created by World War II. With global supply chains disrupted by submarine warfare and territorial conquests, the Canadian government was desperately seeking domestic sources of critical materials needed for the war effort. Intelligence reports suggested that the Nahanni Valley contained substantial deposits of tungsten, molybdenum, and other rare metals essential for manufacturing high-grade steel and sophisticated weapons systems. The military implications of these resources made the expedition a matter of national security. Kiana's team included Dr. Marcus Whitfield, a geological engineer with extensive experience in northern mining operations; Sarah Chen, a cartographer responsible for creating detailed topographical maps; James Mitchell, a wildlife biologist studying the ecological impacts of potential industrial development; Thomas Bradley, a hydrologist analyzing water resources and river systems; and Robert Kane, a communications specialist maintaining radio contact with government headquarters in Ottawa. The expedition was equipped with the most advanced technology available in 1943, including portable radio equipment, precision surveying instruments, and photographic gear capable of documenting their discoveries for later analysis. They carried enough supplies to remain in the field for 3 months, with contingency rations to extend their mission to 4 months if necessary. Emergency protocols required daily radio check-ins with headquarters, ensuring that any problems would be detected and addressed quickly. The team entered the Nahanni Valley on June 15, 1943, following the same route that had been used by previous prospecting expeditions. Their initial reports described ideal weather conditions and excellent progress toward their designated survey areas. Kiana's early radio transmissions expressed optimism about the expedition's prospects, noting geological formations that suggested significant mineral deposits throughout the region. For the first 2 weeks, the expedition maintained regular communication schedules and reported steady progress in their mapping and sampling activities. Kiana's geological surveys confirmed the presence of tungsten-bearing ore bodies that could potentially support large-scale mining operations. The team documented their findings with detailed photographs and core samples that would be invaluable for future development planning. The first indication of problems came on June 30th, when the team's scheduled radio contact was 45 minutes late. Kiana's transmission was brief and somewhat garbled, reporting equipment malfunctions and unexpected weather conditions that were hampering their work. She indicated that the team would be moving to a new location the following day and would resume normal communication schedules once they had established their next base camp. That was the last coherent radio transmission ever received from Kiana's expedition. On July 1st, headquarters received only static and fragments of what sounded like human voices speaking in urgent, agitated tones. Technical analysis of the transmission revealed multiple speakers, suggesting that all team members were present in attempting to communicate. But atmospheric interference made individual words impossible to understand. Over the following week, government radio operators received sporadic bursts of transmission from the expedition's frequency, but the signals were increasingly degraded and incomprehensible. Voice pattern analysis suggested that the number of speakers was declining, with fewer distinct individuals participating in each attempted communication. By July 8th, the transmissions had ceased entirely, leaving only electronic silence from the Nahanni Valley. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police organized an immediate search and rescue operation, dispatching their most experienced Northern Patrol officers to locate the missing expedition. The searchers followed the team's planned route, looking for campsites, equipment caches, and any other signs of their passage through the wilderness. What they discovered raised more questions than it answered. At the expedition's first documented campsite, searchers found a complete breakfast still laid out on a folding table, with coffee in metal cups and food on plates, as if the team had been interrupted during their morning meal. Personal belongings were scattered around the site, but valuable equipment, including cameras, surveying instruments, and geological samples had vanished without explanation. The scene suggested a hasty departure rather than an organized relocation to a new research area. The second campsite revealed even more disturbing evidence. Kiana's personal journal had been abandoned near the cold remains of a campfire, its final entries documenting increasingly strange observations about the valley's geology and wildlife. Her handwriting became progressively more erratic as the entries progressed, suggesting mounting stress or psychological pressure that had affected her ability to maintain scientific objectivity. The journal's final entry, dated June 29th, described phenomena that challenged conventional understanding of natural processes. Kiana wrote about rock, formations that seemed to change position overnight, mineral samples that displayed properties inconsistent with known physics, and wildlife behavior patterns that suggested the presence of some disturbing influence in the valley's ecosystem. Her final paragraph mentioned recurring nightmares experienced by all team members, dreams that seemed to share common elements despite the impossibility of collective unconscious experience. Searchers discovered additional campsites that showed signs of increasing disorganization and panic. Equipment had been abandoned in apparent haste, with expensive instruments left exposed to weather damage that would render them useless for scientific purposes. Food supplies were scattered and partially consumed, suggesting either wildlife interference or human behavior that had become increasingly irrational. The most chilling discovery was made at what appeared to be the team's final campsite, located in a remote canyon that did not correspond to any location on their planned itinerary. The site showed evidence of a substantial fire that had burned far hotter than any normal campfire, leaving behind melted metal fragments and crystallized sand that suggested temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. No conventional fuel source could have generated such intense heat in a wilderness environment. Among the fire's remains, searchers found fragments of the team's radio equipment, cameras, and scientific instruments, all bearing evidence of deliberate destruction rather than accidental damage. The metal components had been systematically dismantled and fed into the fire, as if someone had been determined to prevent any documentation of their discoveries from reaching the outside world. Most disturbing of all, the searchers found clear evidence that all 6 expedition members had been present at the final campsite. Personal belongings belonging to each team member were discovered in the area, including Kiana's distinctive geological hammer and Dr. Whitfield's customized surveying equipment. But despite extensive searching of the surrounding area, no human remains were ever located. The absence of bodies was particularly puzzling given the isolated location and harsh environmental conditions that would have made survival impossible for extended periods. The team had been missing for over a month when the search was conducted, long enough for environmental factors to have claimed any survivors who might have been stranded without proper equipment and supplies. Analysis of the final campsite revealed footprints and other traces suggesting that the team members had been moving erratically around the area, following patterns that seemed random and purposeless rather than the systematic approach that would be expected from trained scientists. The tracks indicated that the expedition members had spent considerable time at the site, possibly several days, engaged in activities that left no clear explanation for their purpose or methodology. Government investigators attempted to reconstruct the expedition's final days using the fragmentary evidence available from their various campsites. The timeline suggested that the team had gradually abandoned their scientific mission in favor of some other objective that had become increasingly important to them. Their movement pattern indicated a progression deeper into the valley's most remote areas, far from their original survey locations and beyond any regions that would have been relevant to their mineral assessment work. The investigation revealed that Kiana's team had discovered something in the Nahanni Valley that had fundamentally altered their mission parameters. Their systematic destruction of communication equipment suggested a deliberate decision to cut contact with the outside world, while their abandonment of valuable scientific instruments indicated that they had found something more important than their original research objectives. The mystery deepened when investigators discovered that the expedition's supply caches, which had been pre-positioned along their planned route, remained untouched throughout their time in the valley. The team had apparently stopped using their carefully planned logistics system, instead relying on unknown resources that had allowed them to survive in areas where conventional wilderness techniques would have proven inadequate. Years later, occasional discoveries would add fragments to the puzzle of Kiana's vanished expedition. Hikers and prospectors reported finding pieces of equipment bearing government markings in remote locations throughout the valley. These artifacts were always found individually, scattered across vast distances as if they had been deliberately distributed to prevent anyone from tracing them back to a common source. The fate of Kiana Rodriguez and her 5 team members remains one of the Nahanni Valley's most enduring mysteries. The expedition had entered the valley as a routine scientific survey and had instead encountered something that had transformed them from government researchers into participants in whatever dark forces had shaped the region's violent history. Their disappearance added 6 more names to the growing list of people who had ventured into the Valley of the Headless Men and had never returned. But unlike previous victims who had left behind evidence of violence or supernatural intervention, Kiana's team seemed to have made a conscious choice to abandon their former lives and embrace whatever secrets the valley had revealed to them. The missing expedition represented more than just another tragedy in the Nahanni Valley's bloody history. It suggested that the valley's influence extended beyond simple violence to include psychological and spiritual transformations that could cause rational, scientifically trained individuals to abandon everything they had previously valued in pursuit of knowledge that existed beyond conventional understanding. Kaladin Thompson had spent 15 years as a bush pilot flying supply runs to remote trappers and prospectors scattered throughout the Northwest Territories. He had seen his share of tragedy in the northern wilderness, from hypothermia victims to plane crashes to men who had simply vanished without explanation. But nothing had prepared him for what he discovered during a routine supply drop to John O'Brien's cabin in the winter of 1945, a scene so bizarre and unsettling that it would haunt him for the remainder of his days. O'Brien had been one of Kaladin's regular clients, a World War I veteran who had retreated to the isolation of the Nahanni Valley after returning from the battlefields of France with physical wounds that had healed but psychological scars that had not. Like many ex-soldiers, O'Brien found solace in the solitude of the northern wilderness, where the only enemies were cold, hunger, and the occasional predator, rather than the human monsters he had faced in the trenches of Europe. The former infantryman had established his trapline in a remote section of the valley, far from the areas where other prospectors and trappers operated. He preferred complete isolation, maintaining minimal contact with the outside world except for Kaladin's monthly supply flights that brought him ammunition, tobacco, medical supplies, and news from civilization. O'Brien was a methodical man who followed strict routines designed to maximize his survival chances in an environment where small mistakes could prove fatal. Kaladin's December 1945 flight to O'Brien's cabin had been delayed by severe weather conditions that had grounded aircraft throughout the territory for over a week. When he finally managed to take off, he was concerned about O'Brien's welfare, knowing that the veteran's supplies would be running dangerously low. The experienced trapper had always maintained generous stockpiles of food and fuel, but even the best-prepared wilderness dweller could find himself in mortal danger if supply deliveries were delayed too long. The flight to O'Brien's camp took place during one of the coldest spells on record, with temperatures dropping to -40 degrees Fahrenheit and lower. Even inside his heated aircraft cabin, Kaladin could feel the intense cold penetrating through the insulation. He knew that anyone caught outside without adequate protection would have only minutes before hypothermia and frostbite became life-threatening conditions. When Kaladin circled over O'Brien's camp to assess the landing conditions, he immediately noticed something wrong. No smoke was rising from the cabin's chimney, despite the bitter cold that would have required constant heating to maintain survivable temperatures inside. The snow around the cabin was undisturbed, suggesting that O'Brien had not been outside for several days. Most troubling of all, there was no response to the aircraft's engine noise, which usually brought the trapper outside to assist with the landing and unloading procedures. Kaladin landed his ski-equipped plane on the frozen lake near O'Brien's camp, struggling against powerful crosswinds that threatened to flip the aircraft. He taxied to the makeshift dock that O'Brien had constructed for supply deliveries, cut the engine, and prepared to investigate the ominous silence that had settled over the camp like a shroud. The scene that confronted Kaladin as he approached the cabin defied every principle of wilderness survival that he had learned during his years of flying to remote locations. O'Brien was sitting upright beside the cold fireplace, hunched over a carefully arranged pile of tinder and kindling as if he had been preparing to light a fire. In his right hand, he clutched a book of matches, with one match partially torn from the book, as if he had been in the process of striking it when death claimed him. The veteran's body was frozen solid, preserved by the sub-zero temperatures that had turned the cabin into a natural deep freeze. His clothes showed no signs of violence or struggle, and his face bore an expression of intense concentration rather than fear or pain. Everything about the scene suggested that O'Brien had simply been overcome by cold while attempting to start a fire that might have saved his life. But the more Kaladin examined the scene, the more puzzling it became. O'Brien was an experienced woodsman who would have known the importance of maintaining a constant fire during extreme weather conditions. The cabin contained ample supplies of seasoned firewood, enough to last through several weeks of continuous burning. There was no apparent reason why the fireplace should have been allowed to go cold in temperatures that would have quickly become lethal. Even more mystifying was the condition of O'Brien's fire-starting materials. The pile of tinder was expertly prepared, with fine wood shavings and dried moss arranged in exactly the configuration that would have produced a robust flame with minimal effort. The kindling was properly sized and positioned to catch fire from the tinder and sustain combustion long enough to ignite larger pieces of firewood. O'Brien had demonstrated perfect knowledge of fire-building techniques right up to the moment of lighting the match. Kaladin's investigation of the cabin revealed additional puzzles that complicated any attempt to understand O'Brien's death. The veteran's daily journal, found open on the table beside his frozen body, contained entries that documented increasingly strange observations about the behavior of wildlife in the area. O'Brien had noted that animals seemed to be avoiding his camp, with no tracks visible in the snow despite the abundance of game that usually characterized the region. The journal's final entries described O'Brien's growing concern about noises he had been hearing at night, sounds that seemed to circle the cabin without ever approaching close enough to be identified. He wrote about shadows moving past the windows, always at the periphery of vision, and gone before he could get a clear look at whatever was causing them. His handwriting showed increasing signs of stress and sleep deprivation as the entries progressed. Most disturbing were O'Brien's repeated references to feeling watched, even when he was certain that he was alone in the vast wilderness. The veteran had developed the heightened survival instincts that came from years of combat experience, instincts that had kept him alive through some of the worst fighting of the war. If O'Brien believed that something was stalking him, Kaladin knew that there was almost certainly some basis for his concerns. The cabin itself provided additional evidence that O'Brien had been preparing for some form of threat. His military rifle was loaded and positioned within easy reach of the fireplace, suggesting that he had expected to need immediate access to his weapon. Windows had been barricaded with furniture, creating defensive positions that would have been familiar to anyone with combat experience. O'Brien had essentially turned his wilderness cabin into a military bunker. But the most chilling discovery was the evidence that O'Brien's fire had not simply burned out naturally. Kaladin found traces of water in the fireplace, frozen into ice crystals that clung to the stone hearth and andirons. Someone or something had deliberately extinguished the fire that was keeping O'Brien alive, dooming him to death by hypothermia in the sub-zero temperatures that had gripped the valley. The positioning of O'Brien's body suggested that he had been aware of what was happening and had made a desperate attempt to restart the fire before. The cold claimed his life. His frozen posture indicated that he had been working frantically to rekindle the flames, understanding that his survival depended on restoring heat to the cabin as quickly as possible. The match in his hand represented his final, unsuccessful effort to cheat death. Kaladin's examination of the area around the cabin revealed tracks in the snow that defied easy explanation. The prints were larger than those of any known animal in the region, with a distinctive pattern that suggested bipedal locomotion, but proportions that were wrong for human feet. Whatever had made the tracks had approached the cabin from multiple directions, circling the building repeatedly, before apparently gaining entry through means that left no obvious evidence. The tracks led away from the cabin toward the deeper wilderness of the valley, following routes that would have been impassable to most humans without specialized equipment. Kaladin attempted to follow the trail, but the prints disappeared into rocky terrain that retained no clear impressions. Whatever had killed O'Brien possessed knowledge of the wilderness that exceeded even the veteran's considerable survival skills. Kaladin's report to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police described O'Brien's death as hypothermia resulting from equipment failure, a determination that aligned with official policies of attributing wilderness deaths to natural causes whenever possible. But his private notes, discovered years later among his personal papers, told a different story about a deliberate murder committed by something that understood exactly how to kill a man in the northern wilderness without leaving obvious evidence of violence. The pilot's detailed observations documented systematic preparation for O'Brien's murder, including surveillance that had identified the veteran's routines and weaknesses. The killer had waited for optimal weather conditions, striking during a cold snap that would ensure rapid death once the cabin's heat source was eliminated. The timing suggested intimate knowledge of wilderness survival principles and calculated patience that spoke of intelligence rather than animal instinct. O'Brien's military background made him a particularly significant victim in the valley's growing catalog of mysterious deaths. Unlike civilian prospectors who might have made fatal errors in wilderness survival, the veteran possessed combat experience and survival training that should have protected him against most threats. His death demonstrated that whatever force was claiming lives in the Nahanni Valley was sophisticated enough to overcome even experienced and well-prepared individuals. The frozen trapper's death also marked a shift in the valley's pattern of violence. Previous victims had been found decapitated, their remains scattered and partially consumed by scavengers. O'Brien's body had been left intact and positioned in a scene that told the story of his final moments with horrifying clarity. The killer was evolving, developing new methods that were more subtle but equally effective. Kaladin's discovery of John O'Brien's frozen corpse added another chapter to the dark legend of the Valley of the Headless Men, proving that death could come not just through obvious violence, but through the calculated elimination of the basic necessities of survival. The veteran had survived the battlefields of Europe, only to fall victim to an enemy that understood the psychology of fear and the physiology of hypothermia with surgical precision. The image of O'Brien frozen in his final desperate attempt to light a fire that might have saved his life became one of the most haunting symbols of the valley's malevolent influence. His death demonstrated that courage, skill, and preparation were insufficient protection against forces that had claimed the Nahanni Valley as their killing ground and would continue to eliminate anyone who ventured too deeply into their territory. Jackson Mitchell had built his career photographing wildlife in the most remote and challenging environments on Earth. From the polar bears of the Arctic to the big cats of the African savanna, he possessed an almost supernatural ability to capture images of elusive creatures in their natural habitats. His work had been featured in National Geographic, Smithsonian, and dozens of other prestigious publications that valued his unique talent for documenting animals that most photographers never even glimpsed. But nothing in his extensive experience had prepared him for what he would encounter during his expedition to the Nahanni Valley in the summer of 2018. Jackson had been commissioned by a wildlife conservation organization to document the biodiversity of the valley's remote ecosystems, with particular emphasis on species that might be affected by proposed mining developments in the region. The assignment required him to spend 6 weeks alone in the wilderness, using motion-activated cameras and remote monitoring equipment to capture images of animals without human interference. It was exactly the type of solitary, challenging work that Jackson preferred, allowing him to immerse himself completely in the natural world. The photographer had established a series of camera stations throughout a 20-square-mile area that encompassed diverse habitats ranging from dense forest to alpine meadows to riverine environments. Each camera was equipped with full-spectrum sensors capable of detecting movement and capturing images in both visible and infrared light. The equipment was programmed to operate continuously for weeks without human intervention, creating a comprehensive photographic record of wildlife activity in the region. For the first 3 weeks of the assignment, Jackson's cameras functioned perfectly, capturing thousands of images of the valley's abundant wildlife. He documented wolves, bears, caribou, and dozens of smaller species going about their daily routines with no awareness of being photographed. The images revealed a healthy, diverse ecosystem that supported complex food webs and predator-prey relationships throughout the valley. But during the 4th week, Jackson began noticing anomalies in his photographic data that challenged his understanding of both wildlife behavior and the capabilities of his equipment. Several cameras were capturing images of what appeared to be large, bipedal figures moving through the forest with a fluid, almost ghostly quality that seemed inconsistent with normal animal locomotion. The figures were consistently dark, appearing as shadows or silhouettes that lacked the detail typically captured by his high-resolution equipment. Initially, Jackson assumed that the shadow figures were photographic artifacts caused by equipment malfunction or unusual lighting conditions. Shadow photography was a known phenomenon that could create false images when light sources, camera angles, and environmental factors combined in specific ways. But the consistency and frequency of the shadow appearances across multiple cameras suggested that something real was triggering his motion sensors and appearing before his lenses. The shadow figures appeared most frequently during the hours just before dawn, when natural light levels were at their lowest and most photographic equipment would struggle to capture clear images. But Jackson's cameras were equipped with advanced low-light technology and infrared capabilities that should have revealed the true nature of whatever was activating his motion sensors. Instead, the figures appeared as pure shadow, devoid of the heat signatures that would typically characterize living creatures. More troubling was the fact that the shadow figures seemed to be aware of the cameras and were deliberately positioning themselves to be photographed. Rather than moving randomly through the forest as animals would, the figures approached camera locations directly and appeared to pose or gesture before the lenses. Some images showed multiple shadow figures standing together, as if engaged in conversation or group activity. Jackson's most startling discovery came when he analyzed the metadata associated with his photographs. The shadow figures were being captured simultaneously by multiple cameras positioned miles apart, suggesting that either there were numerous entities moving through the valley or that individual figures possessed the ability to travel vast distances instantaneously. The timing data showed that some shadow appearances occurred at identical moments on cameras separated by terrain that would require hours to traverse on foot. The wildlife photographer decided to conduct a controlled experiment to determine whether the shadow figures were responding to his presence in the valley. He hiked to one of his camera stations during the pre-dawn hours, when shadow activity was typically highest, positioning himself where he could observe the area while remaining hidden from the camera's field of view. What he witnessed challenged everything he believed about the natural world. As Jackson watched through night vision binoculars, he observed multiple shadow figures emerging from the forest and approaching his camera station with obvious intelligence and purpose. The entities moved with a fluid, gliding motion that seemed to ignore normal physical constraints, such as terrain obstacles and vegetation barriers. They appeared to pass through solid objects like trees and rocks rather than navigating around them. The shadow figures varied in size and apparent form, ranging from human-sized entities to massive shapes that dwarfed anything in the surrounding forest. Some appeared to have humanoid proportions, while others displayed characteristics that suggested animal or entirely non-biological origins. Despite their diversity in size and shape, all of the shadow figures shared the same dark, translucent quality that made them appear more like living darkness than solid entities. Most disturbing was Jackson's observation that the shadow figures seemed to be studying his camera equipment with the systematic thoroughness of intelligent beings conducting research. They examined the cameras from multiple angles, appeared to test the motion sensors by moving in specific patterns, and even seemed to pose deliberately for photographs, as if they understood the equipment's purpose and wanted to be documented. During his direct observation, Jackson attempted to capture video footage of the shadow figures using handheld equipment. But despite the clear visibility of the entities through his night vision binoculars, his cameras recorded only empty forest scenes with no trace of the supernatural activity he was witnessing. The shadow figures existed in a wavelength or dimension that human eyes could perceive, but electronic sensors could not accurately reproduce. The revelation that his own eyes were detecting phenomena invisible to his cameras forced Jackson to question the reliability of his photographic evidence. If his direct observations were accurate, then the shadow figures captured by his trail cameras represented only a fraction of the supernatural activity occurring in the valley. The entities possessed the ability to control their visibility to different types of detection equipment, suggesting intelligence far beyond what conventional science would attribute to unknown wildlife species. Jackson's investigation took a more personal turn when he discovered that the shadow figures had been monitoring his own activities throughout his time in the valley. Trail cameras positioned near his camp had captured images of shadow entities observing his daily routines, apparently studying his behavior with the same scientific curiosity he was applying to wildlife documentation. The photographer had become the subject of observation by intelligences that operated according to rules he could not understand. The most chilling evidence of the shadow figure's interest in his presence came from cameras positioned along the routes he used to travel between monitoring stations. The images revealed that shadow entities were following his movements through the valley, maintaining surveillance of his activities while remaining just outside his conscious awareness. Jackson realized that he had been accompanied by invisible watchers throughout his entire expedition. Analysis of his complete photographic database revealed that shadow figure appearances correlated with specific environmental conditions and times of day, suggesting that the entities followed patterns based on factors Jackson could not identify. The figures appeared most frequently during periods of low barometric pressure, high humidity, and minimal wind activity. They seemed to prefer locations near water sources, geological formations, and areas where previous human activity had occurred. The shadow figures also displayed what appeared to be social behaviors with multiple entities appearing together in patterns that suggested group organization and communication. Some photographs showed shadow figures arranged in circles or lines as if engaged in meetings or ceremonies. Others captured what looked like hierarchical arrangements, with larger figures positioned centrally, while smaller entities remained at the periphery. As Jackson prepared to conclude his expedition and return to civilization, he made one final discovery that fundamentally altered his understanding of what he had been documenting. While reviewing his photographs chronologically, he noticed that the shadow figures were becoming progressively more detailed and substantial in appearance over time. The earliest images showed barely visible distortions in the darkness, while later photographs revealed clearly defined shapes with distinct characteristics. The progression suggested that the shadow figures were somehow becoming more visible or more willing to reveal themselves as Jackson's expedition continued. The entities were adapting to his presence, learning to manifest in ways that his equipment could detect and record. The photographer realized that he had been participating in some form of first contact with intelligences that existed outside conventional understanding of life and consciousness. Jackson left the Nahanni Valley with thousands of photographs, documenting what might represent the first scientifically credible evidence of supernatural entities coexisting with known wildlife species. His images showed shadow figures engaged in complex behaviors that suggested intelligence, social organization, and deliberate interaction with human observers. The documentation challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of life and consciousness in remote wilderness areas. But the photographer also departed with the unsettling knowledge that he had been under constant surveillance by entities whose motives and capabilities remained completely unknown. The shadow figures had allowed themselves to be photographed and studied, but their reasons for revealing their existence remained as mysterious as their origins and ultimate purposes in the Valley of the Headless Men. The shadow people had shown themselves to a man whose profession required him to capture truth through the lens of a camera. But the truth they revealed raised more questions than it answered about the supernatural forces that had shaped the valley's violent history and continued to influence events in one of Canada's most remote and dangerous wilderness areas. D'Andre Morrison had dedicated his career to investigating cold cases that had been abandoned by overwhelmed police departments and forgotten by the justice system. As a forensic investigator specializing in remote area homicides, he possessed a unique combination of wilderness survival skills and criminal analysis expertise that made him ideally suited for examining violent crimes that occurred in Canada's most isolated regions. When the Royal Canadian Mounted Police contracted him to re-examine the 1945 death of Ernest Savard, a prospector found murdered in his sleeping bag in the Nahanni Valley, D'Andre approached the case with the systematic thoroughness that had earned him a reputation as one of the country's most effective cold case specialists. The official file on Ernest Savard's death contained frustratingly little information, considering the bizarre nature of the crime. The 34-year-old prospector from Ontario had been discovered by a passing trapper in September of 1945, lying in his sleeping bag beside the remains of a cold campfire near Headless Creek. Savard had been decapitated with surgical precision, his head removed so cleanly that investigators found no damage to the surrounding cervical vertebrae. The murder weapon had never been located, and no suspects had ever been identified. What made Savard's case particularly intriguing to D'Andre was the complete absence of defensive wounds or signs of struggle at the crime scene. The victim appeared to have been killed while sleeping, suggesting either an ambush attack by someone with exceptional stealth capabilities or murder committed by someone Savard knew and trusted. The positioning of the body and the undisturbed condition of the campsite indicated that the killing had been swift and precise, performed by someone with extensive knowledge of human anatomy. D'Andre's reinvestigation began with a comprehensive analysis of the original crime scene photographs and forensic reports. Documents that had been stored in RCMP archives for over 75 years. The black and white images revealed details that had been overlooked or misinterpreted by investigators working with the limited forensic technology available in 1945. Modern digital enhancement techniques allowed DeAndre to identify trace evidence and environmental clues that might provide new insights into the circumstances of Savard's death. The enhanced crime scene photographs revealed several anomalies that had not been noted in the original investigation. Savard's camping equipment showed signs of systematic search and organization, suggesting that his killer had spent considerable time examining his belongings after the murder. Personal items were arranged in neat piles according to type and value, indicating that the perpetrator had conducted a thorough inventory of the victim's possessions while deciding what to steal and what to leave behind. More significantly, the photographs showed evidence that Savard's campsite had been under surveillance for an extended period before the murder occurred. Disturbed vegetation and compressed ground indicated that someone had established observation posts in the surrounding forest, positions that would have provided clear views of the victim's daily routines and sleeping arrangements. The killer had been studying Savard's behavior patterns, waiting for the optimal moment to strike with minimal risk of detection or resistance. DeAndre's analysis of the original forensic evidence revealed that Savard had been killed using a weapon unlike anything typically encountered in wilderness homicides. The decapitation had been performed with a single, precise cut that severed skin, muscle, cartilage, and bone without creating the ragged edges characteristic of axes, saws, or other conventional cutting tools. The wound pattern suggested a blade of exceptional sharpness, operated by someone with surgical knowledge and steady hands. The investigation took on new dimensions when DeAndre discovered that Savard's death was part of a larger pattern of similar murders that had occurred throughout northern Canada during the 1940s. At least 6 other prospectors had been found dead in their sleeping bags under circumstances nearly identical to Savard's case, all of them decapitated with the same surgical precision, and all of them killed in remote locations where detection was unlikely. The geographical distribution of these murders suggested that a serial killer had been operating throughout the Northern Territories, targeting solitary prospectors and trappers who worked in isolation far from law enforcement presence. The killer displayed intimate knowledge of wilderness travel routes and seasonal migration patterns that would allow him to encounter potential victims while avoiding populated areas where witnesses might observe suspicious behavior. DeAndre's research revealed that the sleeping bag murders had begun in 1943 and continued through 1947, coinciding with the period when thousands of prospectors were scouring the northern wilderness in search of strategic minerals needed for the war effort. The killer had taken advantage of wartime conditions that brought increased numbers of isolated individuals into remote areas where conventional police patrol was impossible. The most disturbing aspect of DeAndre's investigation was his discovery that the sleeping bag killer had apparently possessed detailed knowledge of his victims' activities and movements. Each murder had occurred at locations where the victim was known to have been prospecting successfully, suggesting that the killer was either monitoring mining activities throughout the territory or receiving information from accomplices embedded within the prospecting community. Analysis of the victims' personal effects revealed that all of them had been carrying significant quantities of gold or valuable mineral samples at the time of their deaths. However, in each case, only a portion of the wealth had been stolen, with substantial amounts left behind at the crime scenes. The pattern suggested that robbery was not the primary motive for the murders, but rather that the killer was selectively taking only what he needed while leaving evidence that would support the appearance of random criminal activity. DeAndre's breakthrough in understanding the sleeping bag murders came when he discovered military records showing that several former soldiers with specialized combat training had been discharged from the Canadian Armed Forces during the early 1940s due to psychological instability and violent behavioral problems. One individual, whose identity was classified in military files, had received extensive training in silent killing techniques and had served in reconnaissance units that operated behind enemy lines during the early phases of World War II. The classified military records indicated that this individual had displayed increasing signs of mental deterioration during his service, including episodes of violence against fellow soldiers and obsessive behavior patterns that suggested developing psychosis. His discharge from military service had been expedited due to concerns about his fitness for duty, but follow-up psychiatric treatment had been minimal due to wartime resource constraints. Cross-referencing the discharged soldier's known locations and activities with the timeline of sleeping bag murders revealed a correlation that strongly suggested the same individual was responsible for multiple deaths throughout the Northern Territories. The killer had been using wilderness skills acquired during military service to stalk and murder isolated prospectors, applying combat techniques to civilian targets who had no awareness that they were being hunted by a trained assassin. D'Andre's investigation revealed that the sleeping bag killer had chosen his victims based on specific criteria that maximized his chances of successful murder while minimizing the risk of detection. He targeted individuals who worked alone, followed predictable routines, and operated in areas where their deaths would not be discovered for weeks or months. The killer demonstrated patience and planning capabilities that suggested military training and experience in long-term surveillance operations. The murder of Ernest Savard represented the killer's most sophisticated operation, demonstrating evolution in his methods and increasing confidence in his ability to commit perfect crimes. The Nahanni Valley location provided ideal conditions for the killer's activities, offering vast wilderness areas where surveillance could be conducted undetected and crime scenes could remain undisturbed for extended periods. D'Andre's reconstruction of the Savard murder revealed that the killer had been monitoring the prospector's activities for at least 2 weeks before striking. The surveillance had been conducted from multiple positions that provided overlapping fields of observation, ensuring that the killer could track Savard's movements throughout each day while remaining undetected. The murder itself had been timed to coincide with optimal weather conditions that would minimize the likelihood of discovery by other travelers in the area. The forensic evidence suggested that Savard had been killed using a specialized blade designed for military applications, possibly a commando knife or similar weapon optimized for silent killing. The weapon had been applied with textbook precision according to techniques taught to military personnel for eliminating sentries and conducting covert operations behind enemy lines. The killer had treated the murder as a military operation rather than a criminal act. D'Andre's investigation concluded that the sleeping bag murders represented one of the most sophisticated serial killing campaigns in Canadian criminal history, perpetrated by an individual whose military training had provided him with skills that made detection and apprehension extremely difficult. The killer had operated in an environment where law enforcement presence was minimal and communication systems were primitive, allowing him to commit multiple murders over several years without leaving sufficient evidence for successful prosecution. The case of Ernest Savard and the related sleeping bag murders demonstrated how military training could be perverted into criminal application by individuals whose psychological stability had been compromised by combat experience and inadequate post-service support. The killer had found in the northern wilderness the perfect hunting ground for applying deadly skills learned in service to his country, transforming from a soldier into a predator who stalked human prey with military precision. D'Andre's reinvestigation provided answers to questions that had puzzled law enforcement for decades, but it also revealed the terrifying efficiency of a killer whose victims never knew they were being hunted until the moment death claimed them in the false security of their sleeping bags. The sleeping bag victim had been not just a murder, but a demonstration of how warfare techniques could be adapted to create the perfect crime in the vast wilderness of the Valley of the Headless Men. Jackson Blackwater had witnessed more human tragedy during his 15-year career as a search and rescue coordinator than most people could imagine. From avalanche victims to lost hikers to plane crash survivors, he had dedicated his life to bringing people home from the unforgiving wilderness of northern Canada. But nothing in his extensive experience had prepared him for the systematic pattern of disappearances that began plaguing Nahanni National Park in the summer of 2019, a series of vanishings so disturbing and inexplicable that they challenged everything he understood about wilderness, survival, and human behavior. The first case had seemed routine enough when it crossed Jackson's desk. Marcus Chen, a 28-year-old software engineer from Vancouver, had failed to return from a solo backpacking trip through the park's backcountry. Chen was an experienced hiker with advanced wilderness skills who had completed similar expeditions throughout the Canadian Rockies without incident. His itinerary was detailed and realistic, his equipment was state-of-the-art, and his emergency communication devices were functioning properly when he entered the park. Chen's disappearance followed a troubling pattern that would become increasingly familiar to Jackson over the following months. The missing hiker had maintained regular contact with park rangers for the first 4 days of his expedition, reporting normal progress and excellent weather conditions. His GPS tracking device showed that he was following his planned route and maintaining appropriate hiking speeds. His final communication had been routine, expressing satisfaction with his progress and optimism about reaching his intended destination. Then, Chen had simply vanished. His GPS signal had stopped transmitting at a location along Headless Creek, not far from where the historical murders had occurred over a century earlier. When search teams reached his last known position, they found his campsite apparently abandoned in haste, with expensive equipment scattered around the area and his emergency beacon still functioning but no longer being carried by its owner. The search for Marcus Chen had been extensive and professional, involving over 40 searchers, helicopters, and tracking dogs over a period of 2 weeks. Every established trail, river crossing, and potential hazard area within a 20-mile radius had been thoroughly examined. Ground-penetrating radar had been used to search for buried remains, and aerial photography had documented every square foot of the search area. Despite the comprehensive effort, no trace of Chen had ever been found beyond his abandoned campsite. What made Chen's disappearance particularly troubling was the complete absence of obvious explanations for his vanishing. The weather had been stable throughout his expedition, with no storms, temperature extremes, or other environmental factors that might have created life-threatening conditions. The terrain in his area was challenging but well within his documented capabilities. Wildlife activity had been minimal, with no reports of aggressive bear behavior or other animal encounters that might have posed a threat to an experienced hiker. The second disappearance had occurred only 6 weeks after Chen's case was officially suspended. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a 35-year-old geologist conducting research for Parks Canada, had vanished while collecting rock samples near the same general area where Chen had disappeared. Mitchell was accompanied by sophisticated communication equipment and had been maintaining regular contact with her research team until her radio transmissions suddenly ceased without explanation or distress calls. Mitchell's case had been even more puzzling than Chen's because she had been working in a small, well-defined area rather than traveling along extended routes where navigation errors might have led her astray. Her research site was clearly visible from elevated positions, making it virtually impossible for her to become lost or disoriented. Her equipment was found intact and organized, suggesting that she had not encountered sudden weather changes or equipment failures that might have forced an emergency evacuation. The pattern continued throughout the summer and fall of 2019, with a total of 7 individuals disappearing under circumstances that defied conventional explanation. The victims included experienced wilderness guides, scientific researchers, and adventure tourists, all of whom possessed the skills and equipment necessary for safe travel in remote environments. Their disappearances shared common characteristics that suggested something more systematic than random wilderness accidents. Each victim had vanished while operating in areas that had historical connections to the valley's violent past, particularly locations within a 5-mile radius of Dead Man's Valley and Headless Creek. The disappearances occurred despite clear weather conditions, functional communication equipment, and the presence of emergency supplies that should have allowed survival even in unexpected crisis situations. In every case, the missing individuals had been maintaining normal communication patterns until their transmissions abruptly ceased, without distress calls or explanations. Jackson's investigation into the pattern of disappearances revealed disturbing similarities to historical cases dating back over a century. The locations where modern victims had vanished corresponded closely to sites where bodies had been discovered during previous decades, suggesting that the same areas continued to pose mysterious threats to human visitors. The supernatural legends surrounding the valley seemed to be manifesting in contemporary disappearances that were just as inexplicable as the historical murders. The breakthrough in understanding the modern disappearances came when Jackson discovered that several of the missing individuals had been carrying advanced GPS tracking devices that continued transmitting data even after their disappearances. Analysis of this tracking information revealed movement patterns that were physically impossible for human beings, with position changes that suggested instantaneous transportation across vast distances without traversing the intervening terrain. The GPS data showed that missing individuals had apparently moved from their last known positions to locations deep within the most inaccessible areas of the valley, places that would require days of difficult hiking to reach under normal circumstances. The electronic signatures suggested that the victims had been transported to these remote locations within minutes of their disappearances, traveling at speeds and following routes that defied conventional understanding of human locomotion. Even more disturbing was Jackson's discovery that some of the GPS signals from missing persons were emanating from underground locations at depths that would be impossible to reach without specialized mining equipment. The electronic transmissions suggested that individuals were being taken to subterranean locations that did not appear on any geological surveys or cave mapping systems. Whatever was happening to the missing persons involved transportation to hidden locations that existed outside normal topographical understanding of the valley. Jackson's investigation expanded to include analysis of wildlife behavior patterns in areas where disappearances had occurred. Park rangers reported that animals were systematically avoiding regions where humans had vanished, with migration routes and feeding patterns showing clear evidence that wildlife was actively steering clear of specific locations. The animal behavior suggested that natural predators were aware of dangers in these areas that human visitors could not detect or understand. The most chilling aspect of the modern disappearances was evidence that the missing individuals were still alive, at least initially, after their vanishing. Emergency beacons from several victims continued transmitting for days or weeks after their disappearances, sending automated distress signals from locations that search teams could not access despite extensive efforts. The signals suggested that the missing persons were being held in locations where they remained alive but were unable to respond to rescue attempts. Audio recordings recovered from some of the emergency devices revealed human voices calling for help from what appeared to be enclosed spaces deep underground. The recordings contained references to other missing persons who had apparently been taken to the same location, suggesting that multiple victims were being held together in some form of underground facility. The voices showed increasing signs of distress and disorientation as the recordings progressed. culminating in transmissions that consisted only of incoherent mumbling and apparent psychological breakdown. Jackson's attempts to organize rescue operations to the locations indicated by GPS tracking data had been repeatedly frustrated by environmental factors that seemed to actively prevent access to the areas where missing persons were believed to be held. Weather conditions would deteriorate suddenly whenever search teams approached these locations, with unexpected storms, equipment failures, and navigation problems that forced rescue operations to be abandoned for safety reasons. The systematic nature of these obstacles suggested that something was actively working to prevent rescue efforts from reaching the missing individuals. The interference was too consistent and well-timed to be coincidental, indicating intelligence and planning capabilities that challenged conventional understanding of the forces operating in the valley. Whatever was responsible for the disappearances possessed the ability to manipulate environmental conditions to protect its activities from outside interference. The investigation took a personal turn for Jackson when he discovered that his own activities were being monitored by the same forces responsible for the disappearances. GPS tracking devices attached to his search vehicles showed evidence of tampering with data logs indicating that unknown individuals had been accessing his equipment during overnight periods. His communication equipment had been subtly modified in ways that would allow his transmissions to be intercepted and his movements to be tracked by outside parties. The realization that he was under surveillance forced Jackson to fundamentally alter his investigative approach. Instead of conducting overt search operations that might attract unwanted attention, he began using covert methods to gather information about the disappearances. He established hidden observation posts near areas where vanishings had occurred, using concealed cameras and remote monitoring equipment to document any unusual activity without revealing his presence. The covert surveillance revealed that the areas where people had disappeared were being regularly visited by figures that appeared human, but displayed movement patterns and behavioral characteristics that suggested non-human origins. These entities moved through the forest with fluid grace that ignored terrain obstacles and displayed awareness of observation attempts that indicated supernatural sensory capabilities. They seemed to be conducting systematic patrols of the valley, monitoring human activity and identifying potential targets for future disappearances. Jackson's documentation of these entities provided the first visual evidence that the modern disappearances were connected to the same forces that had been claiming lives in the valley for over a century. The beings responsible for the vanishings were not human criminals or natural predators, but something that existed outside conventional understanding of biological life. They possessed capabilities that allowed them to capture and transport human victims to locations that remained hidden from rescue efforts despite extensive searching with advanced technology. The most disturbing revelation came when Jackson realized that the number of missing persons was actually far higher than official records indicated. His investigation uncovered evidence that individuals had been disappearing from the valley for decades without being reported to authorities or included in missing person databases. The systematic concealment suggested that whatever was responsible for the disappearances had been operating continuously throughout the modern era, claiming victims while remaining undetected by law enforcement. The modern disappearances represented a continuation of the valley's violent history, adapted to contemporary conditions, but maintaining the same essential characteristics that had made the region notorious as the Valley of the Headless Men. Advanced technology and improved communication systems had failed to provide protection against forces that operated according to rules that transcended human understanding of physical reality. Jackson's investigation concluded that the Nahanni Valley continued to pose threats to human visitors that could not be addressed through conventional search and rescue techniques or law enforcement methods. The disappearances would continue as long as people ventured into areas where ancient forces maintained their territorial control, claiming modern victims to add to the centuries-long catalog of those who had entered the valley and never returned to tell their stories of what they had encountered in one of the world's most dangerous wilderness areas.